Hey everyone, David C. Anderson here coming at you from the Knife Center, and welcome to Knife AQ number 87, the knife series where I answer all your questions, whether they are sharp or dull. And this week, the biggest question we are tackling from our list of questions is, how do you choose the right steel for your knives? Let's get into it. So, if you're new to this series, here's the deal. We go through the comments section below this video. That's where you folks get to submit your questions for consideration. We pull out some good ones for future episodes. Then I'll sit here and try to give you my best answer, and Thomas will be behind the camera cracking wise. That's what he does. He does a pretty good job of it most of the time.
No guarantees.
No guarantees. But this week, the first question that we talked about right before the break comes from a person simply named T. He says, CPM D2, N690, 154C, M390, etc., quote unquote alphabet soup. Can you please do a knife AQ on where you would want a particular knife blade material used in folders and fixed blades per usage? For example, an EDC folder used for the warehouse versus a carpenter's use, etc. This is one of those cans of worms that I've struggled with how to kind of frame and how to kind of talk about this subject, because with everything I'm going to talk about here, there are several caveats probably to just about every single point I'm going to make. I'll try to address some of those and address one in particular closer to the end. And I'll give you a warehouse and a carpenter example in particular, but so many other things are gonna depend on the given job and what you're looking for. So I'm gonna generalize things just a little bit more. But speaking of which, some general thoughts. And I wanna make sure I go through it. I might be looking at my screen a little bit much here because I've got some bullet points that I made out because this is a thorny subject to tackle. What I wanna try to do is give you folks the tool set to kind of do this on your own, to evaluate for yourself, because there's always gonna be another steel coming out, and there's way too many steels to cover, even if we made this episode an hour long. So we're not gonna get into that. But what you wanna do is learn what any given steel is good at, and then apply it towards what your job is. And I'm not talking even just about simple things as toughness and edge retention, which are the two big pillars, and stainlessness, of course, but how well a knife or how a particular steel sharpens, how easy it is to finish certain ways. Those are gonna come into play a little bit. And I'd also say that the larger a blade becomes, the more toughness becomes, or the more important toughness becomes, because the bigger a knife is, the more likely you're gonna go hog wild with it. So you don't want something that is a little too brittle to withstand some of that kind of abuse, shall we say. Other general thoughts, toughness is also important on smaller knives where you might want to be a little kind of rough handling with it. If you want to kind of be able to use the knife indiscriminately, toughness is also going to be important. But let's start with the warehouse and the carpenter situations in particular. Both of these scenarios, I would go with a steel that has a little bit more toughness, but not the same steels for both of these. For the warehouser, the toughness you're gonna encounter, or some of the places toughness will come in handy, I think, is especially if you do a lot of things, taking things off pallets, whether you're popping open pallet straps, slicing through plastic wrap where you might hit a nail or something on a pallet. You want a little extra toughness behind the edge, but you're probably gonna be breaking down a lot of things like cardboard too. So you want something with good toughness and pretty good edge retention. And crew wear right now is a really good option for something like that. You've got this right here, Spyderco Paramilitary 2. You've also got something like the Benchmade Mini Adamas. Both offer about the same amount of sharpened edge in crew wear steel. Here's where one of the caveats comes in, however. Steel is not the be-all, end-all in this situation, because both of these blades with about the same sharpened edge are going to behave very differently. The Spyderco is going to be a more efficient slicer with its full flat grind, and its acute tip is not going to be as robust if you were kind of sticking it into things. That's where the Mini Adamas could be an advantage. You've got a more robust tip there, and less efficient slicing, but a little more toughness as a result. Steel is part of the choice. Geometry is part of the choice you're going to need to make also. One other thing that I don't know what either of these companies hit when they, off the top of my head right here, what their hardness rating is, but if one of these is harder than the other, then the harder one will hold an edge a little bit longer, but it won't be quite as tough. So those are two big caveats right there. Steel isn't everything. Make sure to look at the whole picture as well. Because it could be a situation where a real thin blade out of Crewware might not be as good an option as a thicker stainless blade that still has some decent toughness for this particular use. Keep that in mind. When we come to the Carpenter, I think this is really interesting, and I'm sure the weeds are growing by now, Thomas.
They've been on a hair trigger.
This whole discussion is very much in the weeds, and it's a good thing because more knowledge is always a good thing. With the Carpenter, I'd want to go with something tough as well, but I'd want to go with something that could take a mirror polished edge fairly easily, because when you're talking hardwood and push cuts, mirror polished edge is a match made in heaven for stuff like that. Simpler stainless steels, simpler than stuff like Crewware, which is a particle steel, high-tech stuff. Simpler carbon steels are going to be great. 10 series like 1095, 1084, that sort of thing. SK5, like on this cold steel Ranch Boss right here. Very easy to get a very mirror-like edge on these knives. Another caveat, grinds come into play here again. Maybe you want to go with something with a Scandi grind, which is phenomenal on wood. It's kind of like a double-planed chisel. This is a Norwegian-made knife, the Hella Blea. It comes with a Sandvik 12C27 stainless blade, but this is one of those tougher stainlesses that can still take a very fine edge very easily. And it's also really comfortable for working. That's something, for instance, that Ranch Boss actually, even though I just offered it as a suggestion, isn't going to be nearly as comfortable if you're using it hard on some hard wood, whereas that Hella could make a great choice. And the steel is going to be a nice complement to that sort of task as well. All right, let's pull it back out though and talk generalities. And kind of break things down into a few segments. General use knives, whether it's folding or fixed blade, that are just intended to cut things. I know that may sound silly because all knives are supposed to cut things, but just slicers, nothing that is going to be kind of hammered on, abused, used roughly. Then you go with something that toughness is not necessarily as important. Some steels that tend to work good in this category would be stuff like D2. You mentioned N690 and 154 CM. I'd put them in this category. I'd put M390 in this category as well. You mentioned that. Seen on this MKM Gochia right here. 20 CV, that's the same stuff. S110V, CPM 10V, doesn't have to be a stainless to go in this category. In fact, D2 is only semi-stainless. All of these different steels have varying degrees of edge retention, but aren't particularly tough on the grand scale of things. So they all fit really well in this type of category. Moving up, if you want a rougher use knife, whether it's fixed or folding again, we'll call them mid-size here. Crewware, as mentioned, great choice, especially if it has the blade geometry to support it. That Sandvik steel, in addition to stuff like AEBL and 14C28N, more alphabet soup, I know. Even stuff like CPM 154 or CPM D2, as opposed to the non-CPM versions we just talked about, have enough, a decent amount of toughness. Not as much as something like Crewware, but enough toughness that it'll give you a little more peace of mind while still having good edge retention. S35VN even could be in this particular category. Then when you get to bigger stuff, toughness becomes, the most important factor typically, at least the way I rank things. 10 series carbon steels like this 1095 on this ESEE Hunglas 2. Fantastic stuff, very tough. If you want more edge retention, there's a lot of good tool steels out there. Not D2. D2, again, is not particularly high on the toughness scale, but stuff like A2 on this Hogue EX F01, really good stuff and better edge retention than the 10 series. And you could go with more exotic stuff like CPM 3V or M4. M4 is a great choice, actually. And that brings me to probably the biggest caveat at all, apart from heat treat and geometry also matter just as much as blade steel, is none of these categories that I just laid out with steel suggestions, none of those steels should be exclusive to any of those categories. Because guess what? Is 1095 gonna do well in every one of these categories? Heck yeah, actually. Unless you're creating a high stainless category. If you need that, 1095 is not so good. But M4 is a perfect example because I love carrying this knife right here. Not this particular one, but I have one of these, the Bailout from Benchmade, with a very thin, slicey blade of M4. That toughness is, you're not chopping with this knife, but it's a steel that works on this small, thin bladed knife here because it gives you a little more stability behind the edge because of that toughness. And it's really pleasant to sharpen as well. So that's the big caveat right there. Pretty much everything, to degrees, varying degrees, will work pretty much everywhere. There's some definitely things that are more attuned to certain things. But again, take some of this, do a bit of your own research as well from reputable sources, stuff like KnifeSteelNerds.com especially I like to recommend. Figure out a few kind of touchstone steels that you might be familiar with. D2, S30V, those are pretty common things that most folks have experienced. And once you've used it enough, you get a feel for what that is. Read about the properties of that steel, and then you can start comparing them to the written properties of other things. And you can start to kind of come up with a hierarchy on your own. Because I can't cover it all for anyone. This is just some bullet points here. Let me just check my bullets. Speaking of bullet points, let me just check to make sure I didn't miss anything. As new steels come out, again, this is gonna help you as you are able to compare things with known bullet points. But speaking of Knife Steel Nerds, Dr. Laren Thomas, who runs that website, has come out with a steel last year, CPM Magna Cut, which is all the rage. And it's one of those things that seems, the consensus is, there's not a single thing out there just about where it isn't one of the best options in every category. Pretty cool stuff. And a bit of a game breaker, so to speak. But anyway, I know that's a lot of information to absorb. I hope I got all of my points across, and I hope I'm not leading anyone astray. Take what you like and build around it. That's what we all have to do, and that's how I got here. Partly is doing research and testing things out and experimenting, and just keeping at it. That's what you have to do too. Hope that helps.
And if it didn't, we have a comment section.
If it didn't, we have a comment section. There we go. Next question comes from Donnie Doobie. What is the difference between an onlay and a scale? Also, is a thumb stud better than a thumb disc, or is it just a matter of personal preference and taste? I'll start with the thumb disc question. Whether it's better than a thumb stud, it's not better or worse. It's pretty much down to personal taste. Because the other thing too is, any given manufacturer can do a poor or a good job at either of those styles of opening. This ZT does a good job. Don't let me subliminally suggest it doesn't, but really it's down to personal preference. The disc, the way it is here, might get into the way of the cutting edge just a little bit, but you can angle around it. Thumb studs can certainly get in the way, the same way. But be that as it may, onlay versus scale. It's a little bit, this one right here, this ZT 640, I almost called it the 22. This ZT 640, it's a good thing it's written on the back of the blade, huh?
Indeed.
This is one that rides the line a little bit. Some onlays are very easy to tell because they sit very much inside the handle, and as opposed to an inlay, like you see on this cold steel that is inset into the material, the onlay just sits on top of, which of course scales kind of do the same thing. Both of these Spyderco Benchmades we looked at right at the top, you have scales on each of those. But even if a scale is letterboxed a little bit, like on this Civivi Elementum, you can see a little bit of the liner there, we still consider this, or I still consider this a scale, because it's almost full width and it forms the big bulk of the handle. This one I probably would call an onlay because it's in just a little bit more, but it's borderline. I wouldn't call you out for calling that a scale. Now, where is the line between a scale and an onlay? It is not defined anywhere. It's kind of a personal judgment call. But like I said, you could call that a scale or an onlay. I wouldn't be upset about either, but if you called the Elementum scale an onlay, I'd probably say, I wouldn't necessarily call it that, but be that as it may, it's one of those gray areas. This is one of those gray areas too. Satin finish. Anyway, I'm a dad now, folks. It's fine. I'm allowed. Which brings us to our lightning round for today, because our first question took up so much time from the regular round. First question is from Mud Puppy. Every knife I've ever bought has busted the clip off in a few months or less. Can anyone recommend a knife with a good clip? I have a drawer full of bent clips and screws. The easiest thing to do there is to look for stuff like this CJRB Escoria right here with a milled pocket clip. This one isn't the most robust, but there are plenty of extremely robust pocket clips. It's not impossible that you might still bend one of these, but it is much less likely because they are stronger. And if that is still not doing it for you, I would suggest just finding a good cheap source for aftermarket clips. That's the good part about a lot of stuff these days, is they're easy to swap in a new one. So,
or a belt sheath.
Or go to a belt sheath. That's always true. That's always an option as well. Hope that helps. All right, Josh, 33025. Hey, DCA, is a Tanto blade still a Tanto if you round the secondary point off? As a matter of fact, some might say it's even more of a Tanto, such as you see on this Fox Ryu right here, because a traditional Japanese Tanto doesn't actually have that secondary point that you might see on an Americanized or Western style Tanto. So there you go.
Now reverse it.
We almost made it through a whole video without your unspeakable travesty of a name for a blade shape. Oh my gosh. Which brings us to our most serious question of the day, which comes from Egoitz Salsamendi. I like Salsamendi. That's a great last name. I hope it's your actual last name, because that's pretty cool. Hey, DCA and Thomas, question. What folder would Indiana Jones carry? Challenge. It should be in accordance with the timeline. Keep up the great job. Thanks. He must be talking to you on that part. This one's easy, actually, because he carried an old German-made Linder knife, which they still made up until they went out of business like last year. So something like this Boker would be just about the same sort of thing. This is the Boker Mono. It has a crew wear blade, which it wouldn't have had a crew wear blade back then. It would have been a simple carbon steel, and a stag handle and a lock back with this raised tab to unlock the blade. But this is of course very slow, because he's probably just going to pull out his revolver and cap the guy instead, which, is what happens. All right, that's all we have time for today. I hope this all helped, and let me know what you thought of the answers. Let me know if you have some alternate answers in the comments, and drop your own questions down there as well, and maybe it'll get picked for a future episode. To get your hands on any of these knives, we'll leave links in the description to take you over to KnifeCenter.com. And don't forget about our Knife Rewards program, because if you're gonna put your money down on one of these knives today, you might as well be earning some free money to spend on your next one. I'm David C. Anderson from the Knife Center. That's Thomas behind the camera, and we're signing off. See you next time.